Hello! Welcome to the channel! Yeah, this is my new channel called Joe Does Books, where me, a guy named Joe, does books. We're gonna talk about books here. We're gonna talk about novels, mainly in the sci-fi, fantasy, history realm, but we're gonna go and dip our toes into a little bit of everything. I'm gonna give some reviews, some rankings, all that good stuff you love on, I guess, BookTube is what you call it, right? I have another channel where I talk about movies, film, TV, video games, all that stuff, so please go subscribe to that. Link will be down in the description. This will be my monthly recap, everything that I read in the month of February and everything I plan to read in the month of March. I'll go through book by book, I'll give you my reviews for the ones that I have read and my hopes and expectations for the ones I'm going to read. I started off last month on my journey of reading through the Stormlight Archive. Yes, I am a little bit late to the party on the Cosmere and a lot of these big fantasy series, but I have been reading Brandon Sanderson's gigantic Bible-sized books. Now, I read The Way of Kings back in January, and in February, I read Words of Radiance, which is supposed to be maybe the best book in the series. It's the one that's easily the most loved or talked about. And I have some pretty harsh opinions on this series. Some really great opinions. Like, I did love this book. I actually did give it 4.5 stars out of 5. I had a great time with it, but there are some gripes that I do have with the first two Stormlight books compared to some of the other Cosmere novels that I've read. Now, I would love to talk about them here in my first ever video, but I kind of want to save the big Brandon Sanderson Stormlight video for the future. I feel like that's a big video to eventually make, specifically talking about Stormlight. But I did enjoy a lot of what's in this book. I just think there's a lot of this book that is a little bloated. It's a big book. You got like a 1,300 page novel. You know, there's going to be parts of it that are not very fast moving, and I had more complaints with that side of things, the pacing with Way of Kings, than I did for Words of Radiance. But some of those problems do exist here, but the story is absolutely epic. I mean, the characters, everybody loves the characters in Stormlight, right? Kaladin is so cool, and there's of course some excellent stand-up and clap moments in this book featuring him. The world gets bigger, the lore gets bigger, and sort of this idea of where the story's ultimately going becomes a little bit more clear. In the first book, I was a little like, okay, what is the story here? Like, what is the overall, overarching story that we're building towards? In this book, it became a little bit more clear, which I appreciate. It got me excited for the third book. After Words of Radiance, I needed a palate cleanser. I needed something a little bit lighthearted, more fun, easy to get through. So I read Project Hail Mary. This is by Andy Weir, and it's a book that I feel like everybody on this website and on every single website has recommended at least once or twice. The book follows this guy who wakes up on a spaceship and slowly starts to realize after his amnesia wears off that he's been sent on a Hail Mary mission to save the planet. He is humanity's last hope. And the story evolves from there, and it ends up just being a really fun, exciting, but also heroic story about this man who has no other choice but to save his civilization. This man who is alone. Or is he? There's a lot of stuff that I would love to talk about this book, but I feel like one of the big, amazing things about this novel that made it so incredible was the discovery of what this book actually is. So I'm not going to spoil anything. All I'm going to say is it's a ton of fun, it's super easy to read, I flew through this thing, and I think all of you would probably enjoy it if you haven't already read it. After that, I jumped into some Stephen King, believe it or not. I'm not the biggest Stephen King reader, but this is a book that I've been wanting to read from Stephen King for a long time. There is a movie adaptation coming from it soon, and it's just a very, very cool concept, a very Battle Royale type concept. I'm talking about The Long Walk. If you don't know what The Long Walk is, it's about sort of a Hunger Games type competition where you have 100 boys who essentially just have to start walking, and they can't stop. If they stop walking, well, they die, essentially. And the last person left gets to pretty much have whatever they want in life, right? It's a very, very simple concept that we've seen done in other ways before, in other Battle Royale type stories. And it's done very well here. I mean, King's writing is very, very good. It's not super, super complex to the point where you feel like you're being taken out of the story. It's very simple and gets you engaged in these characters who really end up being the strongest part of this book. Each character and their desires, and finding out why each kid actually signed up to play this game and what their goals and their dreams are. And the revelations of what happens to each character throughout the story is fascinating. There's another one that's extremely well paced. It actually flies through. I was shocked getting to the final 40 pages of this book and going, he's gonna wrap this up in this amount of pages? Like, that doesn't seem possible. And then it is. It happens. I really enjoyed this book. I gave this one a 4 out of 5, I believe. Just a really, really solid Stephen King novel. I then read This Is How You Lose the Time War by the two authors. I can't remember their names right now, but this is a very poetic novel. It's about this futuristic society, these two futuristic societies that are at war, and these two different agents that work for each society. They're called Red and Blue, who are mortal enemies, and they start leaving each other notes and essentially become pen pals. Now, that concept absolutely drew me in. I was super excited to read this, and unfortunately, it just wasn't for me. This is a very poetic book. I mean, it reads like a poem for the most part. It's very metaphorical, it's very deep, and it's not very action-packed. I was sold in this idea of this giant time war and these two people of immense power coming together throughout all of it, being like this weird Romeo and Juliet type story. And although there are elements, little tads of elements of that sprinkled throughout, what it really is just a story about these two humans who grow to love each other despite the circumstances of their life. The overall world building and the things that are going on outside of their conversations, it's really only sprinkled upon, right? It never gets really fully fleshed out, which is definitely purposeful, and for a lot of people, that's amazing. But for me, I just found myself being very, I don't know, bored? I was hypnotized at different points in the beautiful prose and the amazing writing from both of these authors, but there were just other times where I wanted to move on to the next thing. So I think I gave this a 2 out of 5 stars, which might be harsh. I know a lot of people have this as a 5 out of 5. It just wasn't my cup of tea. And then I moved on to starting, finally, the First Law trilogy with The Blade itself. And this is another book that I might have some controversial opinions on. Or maybe not. Like, I've read a lot of stuff online that Joe Abercrombie, I mean, he's one of the best fantasy authors ever. Grim, dark fantasy. He's like Game of Thrones, but his version, and it might even be better than Game of Thrones. And First Law is like one of the greatest things ever. You have the trilogy, the standalone trilogy, the sequel trilogy. They're all amazing, except that first book. That first book's a little slow. There's no plot. Right? That's like the consensus opinion that I've heard from it. So I was a little weary going in to The Blade itself. A little bit worried that, yeah, let's see what the complaints, if they actually have some merit to them. And, they do. Yeah, this is a book that, it's not my favorite. There are elements of The Blade itself that I absolutely love. First off, the world of First Law is awesome. It's easily already one of my favorite fantasy worlds. It's so easy to imagine in your head these different nations. The Union, which is like the center of the society. The North, which is the North. It's exactly what the North, what you think it is. It's the North from Game of Thrones and every other fantasy story ever. You have the Gurkish Empire, which is... It's Dorne. It's Dorne. It's very simple to understand what this world actually is, but there's other elements of this story that I really, really love. I love how it's sort of a typical fantasy story, but those tropes of fantasy are kind of turned on their head. You have, like, the wizard and these magic systems that aren't really prevalent to the actual world itself. They all feel organic and real and human, which I guess is what the grimdark part of it is. And this is a grimdark story. It's absolutely brutal. I also appreciated that. I mean, people get killed brutally. There is torture here. The characters, which everybody raves about, Joe Abercrombie and his amazing characters, are really well written. Obviously, I really loved Glotka, which I think is like the fan favorite. He is incredible, and his chapters were easily my favorite. His inner monologue is sometimes hilarious, and just who he is as a character is both dark, freaky, but also admirable. Like, you kind of feel bad for him. Logan Ninefingers, don't get too much of the hype around him so far. The big pitch I've had of this story is always... Listen, you gotta read First Law, because Logan Ninefingers, my god, his character is unbelievable. And I didn't get that from this book. He just seems like a badass dude, which we've had a lot of badass dudes and a lot of badass stories. But I'm excited to see in the sequels, which I will be reading, if he does come out to be one of the greatest characters ever. Overall, though, my main complaints with this book is just that it's a little too long, and it doesn't, you know, it meanders. There's a lot of chapters where not much happens, and it does slow itself down. Like, this thing put me in a little bit of a reading slump, because it took me a while to get through some of these chapters where the pacing is just so slow. But when the book gets to its final act, and you start getting into, alright, this is going to be the larger story of the First Law trilogy, this is kind of where we're going, this is how all these characters are going to come together, it became very clear, like, okay, yeah, this is some good shit. So I did give The Blade itself a 3 out of 5, and I'm hoping that it is the worst of Abercrombie, and now everything else that I read is just going to go up from there. I do have very, very high hopes for the rest of the trilogy. I ended the month reading about haven't finished it yet, half of One Dark Window, which is the first book in the Shepherd's King duology, which I've heard so much about. They've been sitting on my shelf for like a year now, so I wanted to read these. Hopefully, I thought they would be kind of like a palate cleanser after The Blade itself, some 2 books I could take down very, very quickly, and so far, that's been true. I'm flying through this thing. It's very fun, very gothic, a little lighthearted, a little YA-ish at points, but it's just an easy read that has really good characters, a really awesome and cool magic system, and I'm excited to just knock this one down, knock the second one down, because to start into my TBR for March, of course, I would love to finish One Dark Window, and I would also love to finish Two Twisted Crowns, which I'll be reading as soon as I finish that. Hopefully in the next week, I'll have this thing knocked out of the park, and yeah, these books are exciting. It's a good duology. Rachel Gillig is a very good writer, and I'm excited about these. After I knock those down, I have a few book ones that I'm going to be starting. Yeah, I'm just starting myself in all of these series, which is not a good idea. I've read a lot of book ones, and I'm going to keep reading book ones, and then be in series reading hell, I guess, for the rest of the year. But first off is Dungeon Crawler Carl. This has been sitting on my shelf for a very long time, and yeah, yet again, after The Blade itself and some of the reads that I have coming up later in the month, I just kind of want another fun palate cleanser, just a fun book that I could fly through and just enjoy and not have to think too hard about, and from everything I've heard, this is exactly that. It's a very exciting, fun book that doesn't take itself too seriously and will be easy to read. So that's why it's on the list. And will I continue on with the 15 other Dungeon Crawler Dungeon Crawl Carl books? Maybe, we'll see. Because after that, and this is the one I am most excited to get into, kind of, even though this one also has the same problem with the First Law trilogy, where I heard the first book is kind of hard to get into, but once you get past that thing, my god, it's amazing. But I'm talking about Sun Eater and Empire Silence. Yeah, I've heard nothing but incredible things about this. I'm hoping it's as good as people say it is. I'm going to be jumping into this one this month, hopefully getting the whole thing down. Hopefully this one is better than some people say. I mean, there are people that love this thing, think it's a 5 out of 5, but it's easily the one that I've heard is the weakest in the series, and then once you get to the second one, Howling Dark, my god, it takes a jump in quality, and it becomes one of the greatest things ever. But yeah, I am going to jump into this, I am going to knock it down, and then probably move into Howling Dark almost immediately, maybe going into April. I really want to knock out all of Sun Eater this year, so when the new book comes out, I could be there with everybody else to experience the finale of the story. So yeah, this will be coming this month. Another book that's been sitting on my shelf for a while, another book one, is The Lies of Locke Lamora. Yeah, it's about time for me to read Scott Lynch's The Lies of Locke Lamora. Book one in the, what is it called? The Gentleman's something series? I don't know. Correct me, please. I've heard nothing but great things about this. It's apparently one of the best fantasy things ever. It's just an amazing story about a heist and all this stuff. I do have all of the books on my shelf, and I'd like to read through the whole trilogy that are out right now, although I've heard that this book is easily better than the other two, but I would like to get through them all this year. But at the very least, I would like to try to knock out Lies of Locke Lamora this month, and hopefully do a review for all of you and see if it's worth the hype. Now, the last two here are hopefuls. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through all of those in a month, because, Lies of Locke Lamora, Empire of Silence, they're a little bit chunky, right? There's some big books that might take me a while to get through, but if I do get through those, or I might use this book as a little bit of a palate cleanser, I want to start my Dostoevsky journey, right? I really want to read all of his books. I have a ton of them on my shelf, have not started any of them, and I'm going to start with Notes from the Underground. I've heard nothing but amazing things about this, people recommending this movie, not just on BookTube. I've had filmmakers that I love, like Martin Scorsese, recommending the death out of this. It's a very short book. I believe it's only like 120 pages. Yeah, I'm excited about this. I've heard nothing but amazing things about it, just how atmospheric and how beautiful this thing is written, and hopefully this will be a good entry drug into the bigger Dostoevsky books that I do plan on reading later this year. So this might be sandwiched in between some of the bigger books that I've already talked about this month, because it is small. I could probably knock it out in a day or two. So yeah, this will be on the list. And if I get through all of those, if I read all of those books at some point in this month, I would like to start, not finish, no chance of finishing this one, but start Oathbringer, Book 3 of Stormlight Archive. Yeah, I haven't been too excited to immediately jump back into Stormlight after Words of Radiance, just because that was supposedly the best one, and apparently it just goes very much downhill from here, especially with books 4 and the newest one, book 5. So I'm not super excited to get to those, but I do know some people that believe that Oathbringer here is the best book. I've heard that the pacing is slow at times, and it takes a while to get to where it's going, but once it gets there, that final third act, that Sanderlanche that he's become known for, is easily the best here, and this is the book that really explodes the world and the story. Whether that's true or not, we'll find out. Yet again, haven't been in a rush to get into it, but I'm going to start it either at the end of March or early April. This will be an April book at the very least when I wrap up that month. You'll be hearing my rating for this one, and then eventually, depending on how I feel about this, I'll get to Rhythm of War and Wind and Truth. So that's it. That's everything I read in February and everything I'm gonna read in March. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe. I'm gonna be making videos like this, BookTube videos, throughout the year. If you want great content on movies, TV shows, video games, please subscribe to my other channel, link in the description. I'll see you in the next one.